So anyway, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to talk about fundamentals of competitive intelligence. Like I said, this is really much more focused on process. Because one of the things I think everybody's always excited to kind of jump in and start using tools because we all love tools so much, but it's really important to think through what you're going to do before you get going. So before we really talk about that, let's just make sure we're all on the same page talking about what is competitive intelligence. So the definition we've been using here at ASU, and I didn't introduce myself, sorry guys, Karen Walker here at ASU, Assistant Director of Research Development and leader of our competitive intelligence team. And what we've been doing at ASU with competitive intelligence, we've been saying that CI is the ethical collection and analysis of information to inform decision making. And the 2 points I want to hit on here is this word ethical, because a lot of times when people hear the word intelligence, this connotates, for whatever reason, intelligence connotates things like spying or hacking, and so we want to just dispel that idea right away. Everything we're doing is above board, and really, there's really no reason to do anything unethical because there's so much information out there, either on the internet, you can find just about everything we need, and also with human intelligence gathering, you can talk to people and they're usually very happy to tell you what they're doing. And when you do talk to people, you don't want to misrepresent yourself. You want to make sure you tell people, who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. We're getting a lot of noise. I think somebody's probably unmuted. If you could just, for the duration of the talk until we get to the discussion, just make sure you're muted. That'd be great. Thanks. The second thing I want to hit on in this definition is decision making. So the whole purpose of doing the intelligence work is to provide this kind of what we call actionable intelligence. So key information for your stakeholders so that they can come to a decision. Usually what we're doing is something that will support them in some activity and they need to make a decision, and so that's what we're doing. And so this concept, that the elevator pitch, if you will, is sort of transformation of information into intelligence. So this raw data into this actionable intelligence. So to go a little further into this definition, you can think of competitive intelligence as decision support. So again, we have a stakeholder, a client who is planning to do something, whether it's a faculty member who wants to submit a proposal or somebody in the leadership who is doing maybe some larger initiative or thinking about hiring. They've got some sort of action they're moving towards, and they need they need to make an informed decision. So we're there to provide this kind of actionable intelligence so that they can make that decision and feel good about it. And when I say actionable, what I'm talking about is avoiding the data dumps. We've all seen these reports where you get, pages and pages of maybe Excel sheets, and there's a ton of data there, but what does it really mean? You give that to somebody, they have to do the work of going through and trying to figure it out. And this is the area where competitive intelligence, strategic intelligence, whatever you want to call it, really becomes valuable because the analyst can go through data. The analyst can go through information and pull out those key findings, those, measurable and important information that will help the client make those decisions. So that's where that transformation of information into intelligence occurs. One of the things that was really valuable to me when I started setting up our competitive intelligence function here at ASU was learning a lot about intelligence activities through a group called Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, or SCIP. And I went through their fundamental certification program. Although they're primarily focused on industry practice, there's a lot of their practices that we've been able to translate into an academic environment. And one of the earliest classes I took talked about these 5 pillars of a competitive intelligence program. And this is something that really resonated with me here, and something that we go back to again and again because it just makes sense not only for your overall program, but for even individual projects that you need to have these 5 elements. And those 5 elements are It needs to be strategic. So, you know, it needs to be aligned with your strategic goals. Intelligence needs to be unbiased. It needs to be measurable in order to have an impact. And that's easy if it's, you know, quantifiable, you know, like hard numbers. A little harder if it's more qualitative data, but it still can be done. Actionable. Again, you know, you need to supply something that your client can take an action on. And then this concept of repeatable. So you don't want to, every time you get asked a question or asked to do a task, have to come up with a new process every time. You want to develop your process so that you can just dive in and you know what you're doing and you can move quickly. So that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment here, is that process. But one of the things we also get asked is like, well, you know, what's the value of competitive intelligence? How can it actually help our university? You know, like so many things, it can be hard to quantify, but I can tell you what we've been able to do with the intelligence work that we've done. One of the primary things, and probably the first thing you should do with your intelligence program, is assess your internal capabilities. You have to understand your strengths and your gaps in order to make any other assessments. So like figuring out, you know, like for us being in the university research office, we needed to understand the capabilities of the different research programs. We needed to understand, you know, what we were good at, maybe where we weren't as good, maybe where we were starting to see emerging strengths. So we went out and we did a lot of assessments of different research areas, figured out who the faculty were, who were the leading faculty, what were the centers, you know, where were the major awards, all that kind of stuff. Once you start understanding that, you have a pretty good picture of your capabilities. And this is really the foundational work that you need to do in any kind of intelligence program. Understand yourself, then you can go out and you can benchmark yourself against other universities who are essentially your competitors, right? So you can see who are your closest competitors. You can also determine who are the top performers in those fields. And then when you understand that, you can start to figure out things like, oh, who could start filling gaps for us? So if you have a proposal you're putting together, and say you're really strong in robotics, but maybe it's a big interdisciplinary proposal, and you need somebody who's really good on the social science side, and you don't have that. Well, you've done your homework. You can figure out somebody who is really good at that, and maybe you can bring them in. Maybe you can figure out which faculty might have connections who can bring those in. So doing all of this kind of work will help you figure out how to make your teams more competitive, how to make your university stronger. And then finally, that last thing is understanding the sponsor. What are their needs? What are their priorities? What are they looking to fund? This is all about that funding landscape, which we all know is so competitive. So how do we make our universities, our units more competitive? It's by understanding what we do internally and understanding what other universities are doing, and then tying it all together with what the sponsors want and how we can comply with the sponsors. So the basic process that we've developed here at ASU, this is nothing novel, nothing that we, you know, magically developed. It's based off of a lot of things that we saw in industry. If you go out and look at like the SCIP website, or you look at other websites for a lot of competitive intelligence firms, you'll see anywhere from, I think I've seen 4 to 7 steps in sort of this intelligence process, but they're all pretty similar. And we've settled on basically a 4-step process that we use with our projects. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to walk through this process and explain how we do it, and I'm going to use an example of a project we did a couple of years ago. But there's 4 basic steps. One is the gathering step. So this is a step where you work with your stakeholder to gather information from them, and you work with other sources to gather information for the project. Then you take that and you analyze that information. I put some arrows in here because this is really an iterative process. Sometimes after you do some analysis, you realize there's other directions you need to go. You have to go back and gather more information, and then you need to analyze that. So you may do a few steps of this before you're ready to go to the 3rd step, which we call transforming or transformation. And that's that whole idea of taking the raw data, the raw analysis, and then being ready to make some key statements about it. And then finally, the dissemination. How are you going to get this back out to the client or to other key stakeholders who should have that information? You know, what are the platforms you're going to use? How are you going to keep this fresh? So there's a lot of things to consider as you move through this process. But again, it's really important that you have a process so you're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time you get a project. So the example we have, like so many things, we got a request that was pretty broad a couple years ago. It was from a faculty member who said, I need information on the Nsf Hire, which was Partnerships for International Research and Education program. So this was a program that we had not done, ASU had not done really well in. We had been the lead on 4 proposals. We had not been successful on any of those. We had been a partner on 6 proposals, and we had been successful on 2 of those. But overall, there was a lot of dissatisfaction because, of course, we wanted to lead a proposal successfully. And so we said, okay, we'll produce a program analysis for you. And we did produce a program analysis for them. This actually came after the awards were made in 2017, and the faculty were very dismayed to find that, once again, they had not won a lead proposal. So I'm going to walk through how we do our process, and each step I'll talk about what we did with this Pyre analysis that we put together. So with our first step, the gathering step, there's really 2 steps to this, because the first part of it is your customer engagement. I can't stress strongly enough how important it is to work with your client, because I think this is an often overlooked step, and sometimes it's overlooked because a lot of times we don't really, and I'm talking we in the broad sense of all of us, we don't necessarily get great access to those clients. I know I've talked to a lot of folks who say, well, sometimes I just get this request that comes down from somebody, and you know, they're really high up and I don't get to talk to them. And I know how frustrating that can be. Sometimes you have to try and find somebody close to that person to engage with them to get more information. But it's really important to talk to at least someone who has some information, because when you get really broad requests, there's almost no way you can put together a great intelligence product. I don't know how many times we would get these emails that would come down from maybe the president's office, vice president, whoever, somebody high up, which would be a 1-sentence request. And it would be something like, I need all information on, I don't know, electron microscopy. I mean, it's just too broad. There's no way you can put together something useful on a request like that. So what we've done here, we have a template checklist that we use. And so anytime somebody comes to us with a request, we ask them, hey, can we meet with you or do a phone call and talk to you about your request? And so we work through this checklist, and we'll tailor it for whatever they're working on subject matter wise. But there are a few basic things, and those basic things are talking about motivation for the request. The motivation for the request really has an impact on what you're doing. Why are they asking for this? Are they going to meet with somebody? Who are they going to meet with? Is it somebody internally? Is it somebody externally? Is it somebody in industry? Is it a state senator? You know, those kind of things make a big difference. You need to understand, what they're planning to do. Are they planning to submit a proposal to a solicitation that's already out? Are they planning to look for a partner for something they're working on? Are they planning to set up a center, an institute? So all those things will really drive what you're working on, and you need to understand, why they're asking for your help. The second thing, and this is really important, is defining what we call the key question or key questions. So when you get a broad request, like I need to know everything about electron microscopy, you could go off on a tangent. You could, give them the history of electron microscopy, stuff they're not interested in. But if you start talking to them and you find out, well, we're planning to set up, a center around somebody who just came here and their work is on electron microscopy and they're bringing an instrument, but we need to know more about funding in that area. So if it turns out really they want to understand funding for electron microscopy, that's very different than I need to know everything in electron microscopy. So trying to boil down what they're really trying to find out about and how that's going to impact them, that's what you need to do. You need to get something that you can really work on and will become actionable later on. So that's what we do when we talk to people. We try to find out what is that actionable piece that they really need to make a decision on and turn those into the key questions that we can explore in our work. Finally, managing expectations, that's really critical too. And that's mostly about what sort of product they expect and in what time frame. So if they need something in 3 weeks, but we know it's going to take us 4, then we have to figure out, okay, exactly what can we deliver to them in 3 weeks? Or can we really push that time frame? Do they really need it in 3 weeks, or can we push it out? So just making sure that your client's going to be happy and you're going to be able to deliver something in the time frame expected. So for this Pyre program analysis, we had a faculty member who was thinking about submitting again to the program because they had submitted before unsuccessfully. And so the key questions that they had, one was kind of broad. It was about what does a competitive proposal look like? But then the other key questions that were much more focused was, how many international partners should we have? Because that was a real question about partnering and how many partners would make you successful. And then the other one was, are certain geographic regions favored by NSF? So were there certain countries that they should be thinking about trying to partner with? As far as managing expectations for them, the deadline had already passed, so they were really planning much more in the future. And Pyre was usually issued every 2 to 3 years. Right now, it's looking like it's going to be released in 2020. So we had a pretty loose deadline on this, but we wanted to make it sure it was timely. So we were trying to produce it in about a month timeline. The second part of gathering information is pretty much what you would expect. You've got to go out and you've got to find sources of data and other information to start, putting together your analysis. So there's primary sources of information and secondary sources. Primary is what you would call like main sources of data. So like databases where you have all the actual data that you can work with. Or if you're speaking to somebody who has information and you can gather information from them. Secondary sources might be things like data that's already been collated and summarized. There's a lot of that out on the internet. As far as other databases, most of the large sponsors like NIH, NSF, they have databases you can go in and play with. Don't forget your own internal databases. If you have access to proposals and awards, that can be very valuable for projects. There's other databases with analytical tools that you can use for publications. So if you have things like SciVal, Scopus, academic analytics, things like that. So just figuring out as you start, like where are you going to gather data? And there's a lot of other things too, like press releases. NSF has program pages. Of course, the solicitation is very important. As you do all of this, you've got to keep your key questions in mind. So when you're looking for information, those key questions should be in your head as you gather the data. Human intelligence is really great. It can be very unique. It can be very valuable, but one of the things you have to keep in mind is that it can also be biased. So when you're out there collecting human intelligence from people, one of the things you may want to do is just try to confirm those sources. You might be able to confirm it by looking at information on the web, or you might talk to multiple people, and if you're hearing the same thing from multiple people, that can confirm, the information that you're getting. Finally, one of the things is most of us who are in this area love going out and getting information. We love going and searching through you know, databases or doing Google searches, gathering information. It's kind of the fun part of the work. But you can also wind up going down a rabbit hole and just keep collecting and collecting data. So it's like, when is it enough? And I think you'll know it's enough when you keep running across the same information over and over again. So you got to cut yourself off at some point. And usually when you just keep coming back on the same information, that's when it's usually time to move on. So for the Pyre project, some of the information sources we used, obviously, the NSF solicitation, had to read the solicitation to understand the program. There was also the program page from NSF. Those are always really good sources. We dug heavily into the past award info by going into the NSF awards database. So we exported all of that into Excel and actually wound up putting together our own Excel files using that, and then going out to press releases from both NSF and the awardees to get additional information on the partners involved in the project. Because one of the key questions being who, you know, how many partners, understanding who the different partner countries were, this was really critical. So we wound up using their Excel information and then creating our own Excel file. There was also a great Nsf Hire Webinar with the program managers. Program managers are great sources of information. Sometimes they'll say things in webinars that aren't included in the solicitation or the program page that might give you a sense of their direction and the things they want to see in proposals. So it's really important if you can see a webinar. And also sometimes they will go to universities and give presentations, and sometimes you can pull up those presentations on the web. So that's another nice little trick. We also looked at our own internal proposal data and tried to see if there was anything there that we could check as number of partners and things like that to compare with what we were seeing in the NSF data. Finally, we also talked to some of the faculty who submitted, in particular the two who were successful as partners. And then ASU staff, we had some DC staff who talked to program managers and were able to give us some information. So then we moved into the analysis part of the process. So analysis, again, you've got to keep those key questions in your head as you start examining the information you've got to kind of help keep you focused. You also want to remain objective. So sometimes a client will have certain things that they may want to see. Sometimes it will almost bias you as you start your work. Like they might tell you, well, we really want to get a center. And that's great, but it may be that, you know, we just don't have some of the prerequisites for a center. So you've got to, you know, not focus necessarily on what somebody wants to see, but just focus on what the data is telling you. I always kind of think of that old phrase, it's not no, it's yes, but. So, you know, sometimes somebody says, oh, you know, can we get a center? I might not say no, but I'd say yes, but first you've got to get all these other things and then you can get a center. So just remember, you know, you're not there to like sugarcoat things. You're there to give people the data, the information they need. So as you look at the data, you'll start to see the patterns and the themes and things coming out. You know, it will start telling you a story. But you'll also maybe see that there are things you might expect to see and aren't there. So look for those gaps too. Those can be really informative as well. I think about times that we've looked at awards for centers and maybe looked geographically at where centers have been at, and then seen like a big gap, like maybe seen centers on the West Coast, East Coast, maybe in the South, but maybe a big gap in the Midwest. And you could say, oh, well, you know, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on there. So just think about those kind of things when you're looking through the data, be cognizant of them. Finally, you know, the tools are fun. You know, you can start thinking about what tools you're going to use in your analysis. You know, every institution has access to different tools, but for the most part, they do the same thing. So whether you're using SciVal, academic analytics, dimensions, whatever, you may need to use some of those tools. Different projects, you may need different things. We've used text analytics before for some of the projects. There's a lot of free stuff out there that you can download and use. And then when it comes to methodologies, you may not need things for every project, but you may want to do a SWOT analysis, or we've done scenario planning, which is a very forward-looking technique. So there's a lot of different things that you can employ in your work, and just consider that, do I need this? Would it be helpful? And there's a lot of great books out there that have different techniques that you can look at, or I'm happy to refer you to if you have questions about. So for the Pyre analysis, there were some key findings that we made after putting that together, that big Excel database of awards and we only looked from, I think it was 2010 up. We found that 70% of awards had teams with 2 or more international countries, and they had multiple partners within those countries. Germany, France, UK, and China, and Japan were the most frequent partner countries. The issue we had, though, was since we couldn't look at proposals, we couldn't definitively say that those countries were favored by NSF. It could be that they were on tons and tons of proposals because they're developed countries. They have a lot of universities that people could partner with. So there was a little bit of a waffly finding because we just couldn't say that, hey, those are in favor, in vogue, whatever, but they did turn up very, very frequently. NSF program managers had stated in a webinar that applicants should be seeking geographic diversity. And what this came down to is if you were going to partner with an established country, like one of these countries I just mentioned, you should be seeking to partner with an institution that wasn't heavily used, wasn't in the capital city, just not one of these institutions that they were seeing people partner with over and over again. So they wanted to see some diversity in those countries. And then finally, we looked at the different NSF directorates because this was a cross-cutting opportunity. So all the directorates were involved, and we wanted to see who was awarding the most Pyre awards. And it turned out that engineering had the highest rate. And this was even higher. We compared it to just their overall award rate for like all NSF awards. So they were even higher than their average award rate. And then surprisingly, computer science had the lowest rate, much lower than their normal award rate. So for whatever reason, there wasn't a lot of partnerships in computer science. Now, we weren't saying to our faculty, don't do something in computer science, but it was a little bit of a warning that it seemed like, they just were not making a lot of awards. So the transformation step is really the part where you start to tell your story. You start to put together your story around your main message and figuring out how you're going to convey that to your reader. There's different ways you can illustrate the different patterns you found, if there's networks or other connections that you've seen in the work. You can start thinking about things like graphics. We're very fortunate here that we have a graphic designer who, if it's a big enough project, will work with us, but has also shown us a lot of different graphics and tricks that we can put into our work. But thinking about even just simple things like, word charts and tables and how those can help you get your ideas across. You want to think about not only your basic findings that speak to your key questions, but what I call informed speculation. So this makes a lot of people uncomfortable, providing sort of your own judgments, but it's really the role of an analyst to do this. And so going back to that example with the centers, if you see that gap where you're looking across the country and you see that maybe NSF has, done 3 rounds of these centers and there's nothing in the Midwest, and then you realize that, University of Chicago is really strong in this research area, they would be a good contender for a center, it would make sense to put in your analysis that, you think that maybe NSF this round would make an award in the Midwest, and the University of Chicago would be a contender for that award. You know, providing that kind of information is helpful to your client. Maybe they're looking to partner. Maybe they're just trying to figure out who their competitors are, but that's the kind of thing that they should know. So when we started putting together the information, talking about information into intelligence for this Pyre, thinking about those key questions and the very specific key questions as far as how many international partners should they have, we include that most awards had 2 or more partner countries with multiple partners per country. And then as far as the geographic regions favored, we did supply the information that the developed countries appeared most frequently, but might not be favored, and the information about trying to be geographically diverse. As far as what a competitive proposal looked like, we wrapped that up by saying that multiple partners from 2 or more countries, geographic diversity, and we included that they should tackle issues which have significance across borders. And this was something we found stated by the program managers and also through discussions with ASU staff who had spoken to NSF program managers, and also the faculty who had spoken to program managers. So this was nothing we found in the raw data. This was human intelligence, but we had heard it several times, so we felt that this was really valuable. The final step, the dissemination, might seem the easiest, but it has a lot of danger spots as well. So you need to identify the best platform for your client. Now, typically you might think, well, you know, I'll put together a Word doc. And most of the time we do put together Word docs. We usually put them in a PDF format. But every once in a while you have a client who says, no, I want a PowerPoint. Sometimes for some people, they just want bullet points. They don't want to read a lot of stuff. So you just put together like a high-level document for them. Some people want to see the Word document, but maybe they also want to see the data. So sometimes we'll supply a Word document, but we may supply some Excel sheets too for them. It's really just variable. And we also put together some documents in booklet form. If it's going to be really high level, if it's going to the president's office, then we have to really think about, you know, format in that case. If it's going to be a booklet, it's totally different than a Word document. So you really have to figure out what they want and how to best convey information to people. Confidential documents are a huge hassle. The main reason is because once you put this thing together and you email it or you hand it to somebody, you have no control over it. So you don't know where it's going to go. We typically avoid putting together confidential documents primarily for that reason, because you just have very little control over them. So we avoid putting things in the documents that we wouldn't want getting outside of ASU. If you absolutely have to, then you really have to put together a system for confidential documents and create a control, you know, and stamp everything. And it's quite a hassle. It can be done, but I would advise against it as much as possible. You want to make sure that your information goes to key decision makers. So your client is one person, but then there's other stakeholders that may be able to use the information. So I always talk to the client and say, hey, I'd like to share this with, you know, these other people who I think can use it. I haven't really had anybody have a problem with that. You know, it's to everyone's benefit if you create a program analysis or an analysis of a capability at the university to be able to share that broadly and make sure that everybody's informed. And you know, you have to think about the different ways that you're going to do that. Are you going to email people? Do you have a listserv, or do you have a website that you can share it on? Do you have a Dropbox you can put it in? So there's different ways you can get that out. You just have to figure out what is the way that works best with the people that you're sharing it with. Finally, maintaining a library of past information. So this one is a real hassle once you start producing a lot of documents, and we're living that experience right now. So we have a ton of documents now because we have about 5 years worth of different documents. And we keep them in a Dropbox that we share with a lot of folks at the university. But updating and maintaining that Dropbox is something you really have to think about. How are you going to sustain it? How are you going to build a schedule for checking it and updating things? That's something you really have to consider when you start accumulating materials. So for this Pyre analysis, we created a Word document. And the format that we used is something we commonly use for most of our documents, which is something called the inverted triangle style, which we didn't invent. And the graphic I have here comes from a book from Randy Fearson, who's pretty well known in intelligence circles. I'm more than happy to share his information with you. But it's worked really well for us. And I'll say it works well for us because most of the people reading our stuff have no time to read. Like most people nowadays, they have very little time to read. And so we can't bury our findings at the end. Like most academic writing, you know, you start with a research question, you work your way through testing and all this other stuff, analysis, and then you have your conclusion at the end. We totally flip that, and we have our key findings usually on the front page, because I doubt that most of the time people make it past the front page. I'm always really excited when I get an email or a call and somebody says, hey, I found this on page 5. It's like, oh, wow, they actually read it. You know, I'm always like super excited. I don't really expect people to get much past the first or second page. So we put everything, all the key findings on the front page, and then we work through, okay, so, you know, what is it about? Here's what we were looking for. Here's what we found. Why is this important? And we work through the analysis. And then we may attach an appendix that has raw data in it. We have a lot of people here who are kind of data hounds, so they like to work through the data and they may look through it. But we found this style works really well because they get the information right away, the key things they need to know on the first page. So with this, we put together this program analysis, sent it in an email to the faculty who are interested. We put it in our competitive intelligence Dropbox where it still is. And then the results for this analysis. So NSF has said they're going to release a new Pyre announcement in 2020. So faculty are planning for that. They said that they're going to seek out more international partners, and they paid attention to the findings we had because they felt like they hadn't really, found enough partners, and they weren't doing the diversification and partnership like we pointed out. And so when they're ready to go, we'll probably revise the analysis and do whatever based on the solicitation. If the solicitation has changed what they're looking for, then we'll go back and redo it. So just for today, my key takeaways for you guys: never begin a project without having a key question in mind. Just work with your client, make sure you refine that question so you go out and you feel like you have something that you can shoot for and something you can answer. Just remain objective, remain unbiased. Let the data tell you what it's going to tell you. Remember, your findings have to be actionable. You're giving your client something that they can make a decision on. And then, again, develop your process. Your process doesn't have to be the same as our process, but you find something that works for you. Then every time you get a project, you can go out and you can follow the same steps, and you're not having to do something different every single time. And that's it. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Let's see. Okay, if you want to unmute or go in chat, either way. I will say.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
So what is something that you look for, like a type of thinking when you're, you know, putting together one of these analysis, what's the ideal team for a CI project? What kinds of people do you need in the room and that sort of thing?
For the analysts?
For the analyst, who do you need? Like what kind of thinking or background do you look for in an analyst?
Oh, so what would be the ideal type of person for an analyst? That's really hard because, yeah, when we were hiring, trying to figure out if there was a specific background for somebody. We really didn't have a specific educational background in mind. I think the main thing for hiring somebody to do this work, we wanted somebody with good critical thinking skills. So we wanted someone who could really problem solve, who could approach things objectively, who had some writing skills, who could work with databases. There were certain skills, but you know, when we said things like work with databases, we just meant in a very simple way. We didn't mean like somebody who could do programming, and we got a lot of people applying who were programmers, and it was like, that's not what we were thinking about. It was really almost like an analyst, like the thing we were thinking about was more like what you would think of as like, I guess, a government intelligence analyst who would look at a problem and then try to figure out, you know, well, what's really going on here? How do we resolve this? And blah, blah, blah. So yeah, critical thinking skills, but trying to figure that out from an interview is not an easy thing. So yeah, it was kind of difficult for us to figure out exactly what we were looking for, but being able to talk to people was, you know, and work through some questions. We had questions about, well, how would you solve this? How would you do this? You know, just asking them how they would actually do an intelligence project was very valuable. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I'll just note again that we have our next meeting on January 9th. I think it's also at 10 a.m. our time, probably 12 Eastern, and that's going to be on tool use. And I'll just thank everybody for being here, and I'll let you get your time back. So, all right. See you next time, everyone.